Yo, what is up guys, it's Aqsept here, welcome back to another video. So today, we're actually doing the Nidalee Toplane guide that I promised you guys a while ago. Now this guide might have taken some while to come out, but it's mainly because I wanted to make sure that I didn't give you guys any false knowledge. Like the new season came out and everything, I didn't really wanna give you guys any knowledge which I didn't know was good, and I didn't really play a lot during the preseason because I was really busy, so I didn't really have time to test stuff out. But now that I have, I feel like I've got a better read on her. Anyways, let's not waste any more time, let's get straight into this guide. Nidalee Toplane has been historically one of the better top lane picks in the game. At least back in like season 4 and season 3, it used to be played a lot, and traditionally it was played as a bruiser or tank. Now, Riot didn't really like having Nidalee as a bruiser or tank in the top lane, so they nerfed it and they tried to remove it from the game, and they were pretty successful in doing so, as Nidalee nowadays is not considered a top laner or shouldn't be picked anywhere near the top lane or even mid lane. Now because of this, there isn't really a flat out answer on how you should play it when you do actually play it, and the few Nidalee top lane players that are still left all have their own unique styles on how they play the champion depending on their preference. So in this guide today I will be covering my own style of gameplay, and I will also covering two other pretty famous Nidalee players as well, in order to give you a few options and so that you can try out a bit on what you prefer. Now the three styles of Nidalee Toplane which I will be covering are, as I said, myself, and then I will also be covering Rushfrog, and I will be covering Eshin as well. Both of these guys are pretty known Nidalee Toplane players. Rushfrog used to play professionally in the LCS under the team Renegades, and Eshin actually peaked Grandmaster playing only Nidalee Toplane, so I would recommend checking them both out. Now for the runes in top lane, we all seem to agree that Grasp is actually the best option for the Keystone rune. There are a few reasons for this. The primary reason is that Nidalee actually synergizes really well with the Grasp rune in top lane. She can proc it almost always, pretty much from abusing her bushes, and her poke with auto attacks with it is not even bad. And then she can also swap forms while proccing the Grasp. So if she procs Grasp with a ranged auto attack and then swaps to melee form while the auto attack is in the air, she's actually gonna get the full bonuses from being a melee champion instead of a ranged champion when proccing the Grasp on the enemy champion. On top of this, the increased healing in lane phase is really nice, and the Resolve tree actually makes it so that she's a really survivable champion, if that makes sense. Top lane is obviously a very long lane, so you're gonna need some survivability or really big movement speed. Nidalee does have movement speed, but if she gets stun locked, she's still gonna be really vulnerable. So taking Resolve means that she can't be picked off as easy, and she can survive a lot in the top lane. In the Resolve tree, you're gonna take Demolish because the other two runes don't do anything. Then you're gonna either take Second Wind or Bone Plating, and then either Revitalize or Overgrowth. Bone Plating and Second Wind can be swapped out depending on the matchup. Now usually I don't like Bone Plating too much, but it's actually pretty good on Nidalee because she's a ranged champ, so it's really hard to proc it on her. So most of the time when someone procs Bone Plating on you, you're actually gonna be able to get full value out of it, or at least a lot of value out of it every time it gets procced. Second Wind is also a really solid option though if you're facing a champion that can proc your Bone Plating consistently, and I would actually recommend going Second Wind as the default rune because Bone Plating can sometimes be bad, while I feel like Second Wind you can never go wrong with. Second Wind also synergizes really well with the sustain that you're gonna have on Nidalee Toplane. When choosing between Overgrowth and Revitalize, honestly, I always go with Revitalize. I feel like the heal on your champion is just too strong to not amplify, and if you have any other excuse as well, like you have an Enchanter support or something, just go Revitalize. I know Eshin likes to take Overgrowth, and I think it's because he gets more survivability in the late game and more max HP so he can tank for longer, but personally, I think Revitalize just does the same thing, but it's also good in the early game. When picking between these runes, it should also be mentioned that unflinching is not a bad option if the enemy team runs a lot of CC, but usually I wouldn't go this because your champion is already pretty slippery and you can usually afford to go both Merc Threads and Tenacity rune. Now, while we mostly agreed on what we should take as primary runes, we actually kind of disagree from the looks of it on what we should take as secondary runes. I personally really like to go Presence of Mind and then Legend Tenacity. The main reason for this is that because of the build that I usually like to go, I feel like you really need the mana, otherwise you're gonna run out really quick and you're not gonna have this insane sustain, especially in lane phase as well, that you usually have. And as I said before, Tenacity is never a bad rune, and it's pretty good on Nidalee actually, especially if you go the build once again that I go, because it means that you can pretty much never be killed if you play correctly. Now Rushfrog usually likes to go Sudden Impact and then Ingenious Hunter in his runes. While I usually don't like Sudden Impact that much on a lot of champions, I actually think it makes some sense on Nidalee, because you can abuse both the lethality and the magic pen on her since she deals a lot of mixed damage. And then with the build that RF usually goes, he doesn't really need the mana, and Ingenious Hunter actually makes a lot of sense, especially since the rune got buffed and it's a pretty good rune in general. For the runes that that Eshin usually takes, he usually goes Mana Flow Band and then he goes Celerity. The idea behind this is that he wants the mana from Mana Flow Band and then he goes Celerity to boost his movement speed, especially with the passive on Nidalee. I personally tried this before, but I didn't really like it as I felt like Celerity actually didn't do that much for you. Even when using the Nidalee passive, I felt like you didn't get that much out of it. And I also feel like with Nidalee that actually can consistently poke champions, I feel like Presence of Mind is just a better rune than Mana Flow Band, hence why I always go with that instead of the sorcery tree. Now for the stat runes, our runes kind of differ once again quite a bit. I will usually go with attack speed, then adaptive force, then HP. Rush Frog will usually go with adaptive force, and then either armor or magic resist depending on the matchup. Eshin will usually go cooldown reduction, magic resist, and then armor. Now the reason why I take the runes that I take is because the attack speed actually works pretty well with my build, and then adaptive force is always nice pretty much, and then at the end I like HP because it's usually flat out better than taking armor or magic resist. Around already at level 4, the HP just flat out gives you more value than the armor or magic resist would. The only time where I will take either armor or magic resist is first, if I will take armor if the enemy team pretty much is full ED, or magic resist if they're full EP, or if I'm facing a champion that really wants to deal as close to true damage as possible. For example, if I'm facing a Rumble, then I will probably go with magic resist. If I'm facing a Kled or something that really is vulnerable to armor, then yeah, I will probably go armor. But for my default, I will pretty much always go with HP. Now Rush Frog goes with his runes because he just likes the adaptive force with the build he goes, and then either armor or magic resist into the matchup is always fine. Now Eshin will usually go cooldown reduction, magic resist, and armor. The reason for this is that he really wants to stick on people with his build, so the cooldown reduction is really nice, and then the armor and magic resist makes it so that people have a really hard time killing you. The idea pretty much is that if they can't kill you while you're on top of them, then you will probably kill them. Now if you're going with something at the default on Nidalee, I would just recommend with going adaptive force, and HP. This is pretty much the best. Attack speed is pretty much only the build I play, and as I said, HP is just flat out better almost all the time compared to armor and magic resist. And this is not just my preference, this is a straight up fact. Now these are 3 different rune pages with kind of different ideas on how you want to play the game. While I obviously have my preference, I would just recommend you to try out the different rune pages and see what works best for you, or even implement your own style into it. Now let's move on to the builds. All 3 of us players actually have very different build paths to match our 3 very different play styles. So honestly I would just recommend you trying once again these 3 builds out and then deciding for yourself what fits you the most. Now I'm gonna start off with explaining my build to you guys. So this build is mainly a split push or duelist oriented build. This build first of all synergizes pretty well with the runes that I picked, and it's mainly just designed so that I can duel anyone in the game and 1-1 anyone in the game, and that I can break towers really quickly if I want to. For my first item I usually always go with Divine Sunderer. I might go Triforce sometimes, but usually I want the Sheen proc, and the reason why Divine Sunderer is so nice is that because you're gonna usually take pretty extended fights, so the heal is pretty nice. And also once again you can actually proc your Divine Sunderer with a ranged auto attack as if it was a melee auto attack, just like you could with the Grass proc. You just need to swap form, and this time you can also actually W after swapping form, and it will proc the Sheen auto attack even if you auto attack before as well. This creates for some pretty heavy poke on side lanes and also in lane. The times where I would go Triforce are pretty much times where the enemy top laner either rushes anti-heal or where they play with Ignite in lane. Like if you're playing against a Camille who plays Ignite TP, then yeah, I would just recommend you going for Triforce instead, because it does deal a bit more damage, but it does decrease your sustain. But generally, if the enemy top laner is running some sort of anti-heal, it can be pretty difficult to duel them with Divine Sunderer, so just go Triforce instead. Now for the second item, I mostly go Wit's End. The reason why I like Wit's End is because it gives you the attack speed that you kinda need on side lane and to duel people, and also to push towers. Sure, you have the attack speed from your heal already, but usually this isn't enough to rely on an entire side lane. If the enemy team isn't running a lot of magic damage, then honestly you can, if you want to, just go Triforce's first item and then skip the Wit's End completely. This is something I do sometimes. Or if you just want to run Triforce, because I feel like Triforce is a bit awkward to play with Wit's End in general, just because of the colliding passives and a lot of overstacking attack speed in a way. So if you're gonna run Triforce because of the anti-heal on the enemy top laner, then all honesty, just don't go Wit's End and go with another item instead. Usually for me this item would either be a Hullbreaker, because you already have the attack speed and you can actually go Hullbreaker pretty early on if you rush Triforce, or it would be a Titanic Hydra. Titanic Hydra is usually my third item if I go the Divine Sunderer into Wit's End, and then I would always go with Titanic Hydra, but You have the option of going Hullbreaker as well if you want to when going Triforce, just because Hullbreaker as second item is a lot better than a Hullbreaker as a third item. Personally though, I just kind of prefer Titanic Hydra. It gives you a bit more damage. Once again, you can abuse the fact that you're range champion proccing melee auto attacks with it. It also gives you a bit more wave clear on side lane. And Hullbreaker obviously is pretty useless if you're playing any type of team fights, which even though this is a split push build, team fighting with is not bad, so I would just recommend personally going Titanic Hydra, but sometimes I will go for Hullbreaker if I see the opportunity for it. Sometimes you might also need a Hullbreaker in order to be able to win the side lane, so in that case, yeah, go with Hullbreaker, it's completely fine. For the fourth item, you have a lot of options. Personally, my standard is pretty much just going Zhonya's. While you have a lot of AD in this build, it's not like you stop scaling with AP just because you decided to go with some AD in your build instead. So going with Zhonya's is completely fine, and it also gives you the ability to actually jump in and go for some increased damage at the start of fights or in the middle of fights instead of just playing clean up with your melee form. Some other good options could be, for example, Randuin's or Deadman's Plate. Also Thornmail is a pretty decent item if you need some anti-heal, or even a Morellonomicon if you need some anti-heal. If you want some more MR, then Spirit Visage is a pretty good item as well, especially if you have an Enchanter support on your team or even multiple healing champions on your team that will increase your healing as well. Now the main reason why I like this build is because I feel like as Nidalee you kind of have to win lane, or if you're jungling or anything you kind of have to get ahead, otherwise your champion is just worse than enemy champions. Your champion is a really early game heavy champion, so if you don't get ahead you're gonna be a bit worse than every other champion in the game. So for me, going AD means I can bully the hell of a shit out of my enemy top laner, and I can push for towers, and I can push my leads really hard. This way, even though it might not be the strongest build in the late game, I personally feel like that it's the strongest build for pushing your lead in the early and mid game. And usually with this build, I would be able to get 1k DPM every game. Now 1k DPM is not bad at all, and I think usually when I play Gangplank and other types of heavy damage top laners, that's kind of what I strive for. If I deal 1k DPM every game, then I'm pretty happy with myself. So dealing that with Nidalee Toplane, which is usually not considered a really good pick, while still being really tanky, I'm pretty happy with that. Alright, let's move on to the other builds. Rush Frog usually goes Everfrost. Now he likes the AP style of Nidalee. I know he tried a lot of AD Nidalee builds as well, but he just didn't like it. It wasn't for him. He felt like it was just worse than the AP ones. So that's completely fine. Now I personally find it a bit harder to bully the enemy top laner with this build, but if you do consistently hit spears or traps on the enemy top laner, which is not impossible at all, especially if you play a lot towards melee range with Everfrost, then yeah, that's completely fine. You can still bully them. Ingenious Hunter, which he runs as well, also has some pretty good synergy with Everfrost, especially later on into the game when he procs it a lot. And usually after Everfrost he goes with Shadow Flame. This is mainly to increase his damage and to be able to increase his carry potential and his one-shot potential. For the third item he usually goes with either a Void Staff or a Zhonya's, kind of depending on the game. If he needs the percentage Magic Pen, then he will usually go with Void Staff, otherwise he will usually go with Zhonya's. He might also though sometimes go with Morellonomicon if he needs the anti-heal. Also he will usually go with Sork Boost instead of the Tab Eyes or Merc Treads like I usually go, just to increase his damage, but it makes a lot of sense with the AP build. A lot of the time he will also go for the Banshees if he thinks it's a good game for it, and he will also go for Rabadon sometimes if he thinks it's a good game for it to increase his damage. But the main important thing is that he pretty much always runs Everfrost, and as I said before, he doesn't really need the mana in his runes because he's playing a Lost Chapter item compared to me and Eshin. Now Eshin actually really likes to go with Frostfire Gauntlet for his build. Now Frostfire Gauntlet is not a bad item at all, and it's really good if you're ahead. It means that you can stick on people really easily, you can always pretty much hit your spears if you're good at the champion, which he is. And you can pretty much always chase people down. The increased damage from sticking on people with Frostfire Gauntlet and also the auto attack damage is pretty decent, and then usually after that he actually goes into more damage. Now for his second item he actually tries a bit different stuff, like pretty much all the time. Right now he's going a lot of Lichbane second item, especially after the buffs, and then he usually goes with Cosmic Drive as the third item. After this we see him building a lot of tanks items just to be able to have that increased survivability even though he has a Frostfire Gauntlet. For example, what he likes to build a lot is Force of Nature and Deadman's Plate, and this actually synergizes pretty well with the Celerity rune that he took as well. Now obviously I would like to ask Eshin what usually he looks to build for if he was looking to build like pretty much optimally a standardized build, but he usually goes a lot of different stuff. I usually say he goes Frostfire Gauntlet into Lichbane, into Cosmic Drive, and I think this is a pretty solid build, especially if you get ahead in the early game. Now one difference which he actually does compared to me and Rush Frog, he actually starts with a Doran's Shield in lane instead of the Doran's Blade like me and Rush Frog usually do. The reason why I and Rushfrog like to go with Doran's Blade is because we get adaptive AD then, and it's a lot stronger to poke with auto attacks, which is usually your main damage. If you don't build AD on your first item, you're gonna get adaptive AP, which means that you're gonna have a bit more sustain, I guess, but you're also gonna need to be able to hit your spears more in order to poke the enemy champions. Now this is a trade-off, and while usually maybe not that bad, I usually feel like Nidalee already has pretty good sustain in lane, and usually what you need to do is get ahead, hence why I go with the strongest option to bully my opponent. A lot of the time I actually will go with Longsword as my starting item, and then either 3 potions or a refillable potion. I usually go with 3 potions if I feel like I need a sustain in the early game because I'm facing a heavy poke champion or something like that. But I usually feel like Longsword is just a stronger item if you're building it into something. Now obviously Rushfrog is building AP, so you can't really go for that. But I go AD, so I think for me, if you're playing my build, it makes a lot of sense to start with Longsword. Otherwise, I'd personally recommend going with Doran's Blade as your starting item, but you can also try Doran's Ring or Doran's Shield if you feel like that's gonna fit your playstyle. Alright, let's talk a little bit on how you should be playing Nidalee Toplane. Now when talking about how to play Nidalee Toplane, I'm mainly gonna go out of the style that I play, because obviously there are 3 different styles between me, Rushfrog and Eshin, so it's kinda hard for me to go over all of them since I only play one of them. But in general, I feel like the way I play Nidalee is a bit more duelist oriented into the mid and late game, while both Rushfrogs and Eshins can be played more towards a more standard Nidalee with team fights. And laning phase is pretty similar between all the 3 playstyles, even though we take a few different setups. Anyways, let's get started with how to play Nidalee in the laning phase. So pretty much you're gonna want to start with W almost all the time, no matter what. The reason for this is because your Cougar W, your Pounce, is by far your strongest ability on its own. It means you can kite pretty much any top laners, and you can pretty much always poke how much you want. So when starting off the game, I would usually go into top lane and I would start setting up traps, as you can see on your screen right now. Now the reason for this is because you're gonna start regenerating mana anyway, so you're not gonna be lacking mana when laning phase starts. It's also really good for you when the enemy steps on a trap. Level 1 you're gonna get increased movement speed from it, so you can look for more poke, and level 2 you can actually look for a short trade with W and Q. I would personally recommend placing 2 traps on each side of the lane. Sometimes I will also place one in the river though. I will mainly try to place one in the river if I think the enemy opponent is leashing. Alright, after we've placed our traps and the laning phase starts, how we're gonna play the lane entirely depends on the matchup that we have at hand, but almost all of the time I would recommend playing extremely aggressive. This is because, as I said before, if you don't get ahead as Nidalee, I feel like you're just gonna be worse than the enemy champions most of the time. But you also have a really strong laning phase though. Your poke is one of the best in the games, and then you also have a heal on your E, so even if you get poked or trade like 50-50, then you're still gonna heal up again. So almost always I would recommend trading really aggressive on the enemy top laner. With that said though, I've made a tier list really quick for you guys on Nidalee matchups. S+ here on this list being pretty much what I would prefer facing as Nidalee, and C- would be I dodge or ban. Usually I would ban Teemo. The thing is with this champion is that you can't take short trades against him because he will auto Q you while you will just auto attack, and you can't really hit spares on him because of his speed up on W, and you can't really look for all-ins on him because he will just blind you and then you can't really deal damage on him. So with Teemo you pretty much have to pray that your team wins the game while you're sitting there just AFK farming on the tower. This is not something you want to do with Nidalee usually. And with Akshan you can pretty much not beat in lane with pretty much any champion in the game. He will one-shot you on level 3 pretty much, especially if he plays Ignite, which a lot of Akshan players do. So pretty much from my experience you can't win any of these matchups. With Gwen you have some kind of counterplay because you can kind of kill her early on, but she will always outscale you and she will always be able to win all ins. And you can't really poke her down because of her W. Now I'm pretty sure some Nidalee players will disagree with me on some of these champion placements. Aurelia, for example, might be a pretty good champion against Nidalee, which to be fair she is, but I at least feel like you can beat the hell of a shit out of her before she gets her Blade of Ruin King. After that she will beat you, yes, but that's not because of the matchup, it's mainly because she's Aurelia. And some of these matchups will be kind of like, you can win them in isolation, but a lot of their kit just screws you over really hard later on into the game, even if you just get ganked. Or their kits can go like Ignite and Teleport. For example, Camille and Akali can go Ignite and Teleport, which just makes the matchups a lot worse because you can't rely on your sustain anymore in all-ins. Some of the better matchups that I've placed are mainly just champions that they can't really get onto you, or you just counter their kit really hard. For example, Set can't get onto you at all, but for example Gnar and Wukong who can get onto you, they can't really do anything when they do. Nor in general, you is kind of outrange as Nidalee, so it's not really hard to play that matchup, and you also outsustain him. And then if Wukong tries to go all in on you, all you need to really do in that matchup is you need to rush Tab Eyes. If you rush Tab Eyes against Wukong, he can never kill you, and you will always win the all-ins. Now, I would really like to go through all of these matchups with you guys and explain how I would play them kind of in-depthly, but sadly I don't really feel like we have the time for that. If you guys want to see another guide where I just talk about Nidalee matchups in depth and how I would play pretty much every one of them, then please leave a like, please leave a subscribe, and tell me down in the comments below so I know what to do. Alright, I quickly want to show you guys an example of a game which I played and a laning phase in which I played against an Aatrox, and I'll quickly go over with you guys why I made the decisions that I did during this game. So as you can see on screen, I already placed my traps. And as we also can see, Aatrox actually managed to step on one which procs his bone plating. This is already an advantage for us in the lane. Now as we can see, already at the start of lane phase, I'm pushing minions a little bit to start a slow push, and then I'm already looking for auto attacks on this Aatrox. With that being said though, he's being quite respectful and I'm not finding a lot of poking. But all we have to do is wait for him to go up and last hit minions, or if he doesn't want to do that, then he's gonna miss a lot of gold. Now as we can see, he actually steps up to try and last hit minions with his Q. At this time, I'm trying to poke him a lot. We actually kinda get lucky because he steps on our trap, which means we're gonna be able to get more poking. And I take a short trade with W as well. Now looking at this trade, it could be argued that we actually extended the trade too much and we could just have chased him down with raged auto attacks and completely have won the trade. But as I said earlier, Nidalee's sustain in lane is really good with your E. And personally, I really want to abuse that. So if I can take a trade where he loses 300 HP but I lose 200, or he loses 100 I lose none, then I'll gladly take the trade where he loses more HP. This will make it so that we can look for a kill on him later on into the lane. It is also worth pointing out that this guy was actually playing with Ignite instead of Teleport, so he's not going to be able to take this free reset which top laners usually are able to take, which means that effectively I have a lot more HP than him even when we trade evenly, because I will be able to TP back whenever I want and he will not be able to. Now as we can see, even after the trade I keep the harass up. I'm not giving him any space, and if he wants to walk up for the minions then he's gonna have to pay with it in HP. Now the wave is pushing into his towers, so there's not a lot that he has to do. He can just sit under his tower and wait. So I abused this fact and I pushed the wave in to go for a ward to make sure that I don't get ganked by Lilia, because that's the one way that I lose my lane right now. I place it a little bit further down in river instead of the bush, because it's gonna make sure that I'm not gonna get surprised when she does come. After placing the ward in river, I go back to harassing the Aatrox. When I have a grass stack, I swap form so that my auto attack will count as a melee auto attack when proccing the grasp, and then I W away to not take minion aggro. The idea with the lane right now is that we want to keep poking the Aatrox down until he gets low enough to the point where he has to leave lane or where we can dive him. If Aatrox decides that he doesn't want to be poked anymore and goes for an all-in, we're probably gonna win it because we're Nidalee and we're pretty strong in the early game, and he's also a lot lower HP than us. The only way where we lose an all-in is if Lilia comes and ganks us, but that's why we have a ward in river. Now as we can see, Aatrox does actually go for an all-in on us because he thinks we have overextended. But the general rule when playing against Aatrox is that if he misses his first Q or has to use his E in order to hit this first Q, then we will pretty much automatically win the trade. Because when he has to use his E in order to hit his first Q, or when he misses his first Q, it means he's pretty much always gonna be missing his second Q as well. And as we all know, an Aatrox who doesn't land Qs is not really an Aatrox. Now this all-in attempt of Aatrox actually ends up with him dying, and it not only ends up with him dying but also missing this wave. It also baits the enemy Lilia into running topside and trying to help the Aatrox who is attempting an all-in, but she also ends up dying because of it. Now we haven't done anything super fancy in this lane in order to win it, but we have already won it anyways because of Aatrox's mistake. And because of this we're gonna be able to take over the lane really hard and really bully this Aatrox. As we can see, this Aatrox cannot play the game because of how he played the early game. We just completely take over this lane. But now what we're gonna look at next is how we accelerate this lead into the mid game so that we can actually carry our games with Nidalee Toplane when we do get ahead. Alright, so as we can see this game, 60 minutes into the game, we're really far ahead. We have our Divine Sunder completed, and we have our Withstand completed. We're currently level 12, so we're really strong at this point in the game. So now what we want to do at this point into the game is we want to deny the enemy as much resources as possible. The thing is with Nidalee is that we stop scaling after some time. Now, but if we look at the enemy champions in this game, Aatrox, Lilia, Yasuo, Ezreal, these are all champions that scale pretty well. So usually what we want to do when we're facing champions that outscale us but we scale faster or spike faster than them is we want to push our lead as hard as possible when we do spike. So with Nidalee we spike really hard on one item when we get our Divine Sunder. We also spike pretty hard on 2 items. But the enemy champions that we are facing are spiking harder than us on 2 items. So what we have to do is push our lead when we have that one first completed item when they don't. In this game we did that pretty well, but preferably in this game we want to keep it like that as long as possible. We want to be at 2 items while they are at 1 item as long as possible, because when we get to 3 items we don't spike that hard, but when they get 2 items they spike pretty hard. So our 2 items compared to their 1 item is stronger than our 3 items compared to their 2 items. So our goal right now in this game is that we want to look for fights that we don't trade in but get something for free. For example, if we can take a free tower, or if we can starve the enemy off their jungle camps, then that's really good for us because it's gonna deny them resources while still getting us more resources. In this game we see me going to the side lane a lot. This is because I want to try to duel as many people as possible because I'm so strong right now. And I know if I want someone, I'm never gonna be able to lose it, but I'm always gonna get something for free. Now, if whoever I'm side laning against don't want to duel me, then I can just push for tower. I'm a range champion, so they can't really do a lot if I'm sitting there pushing a tower with a mini wave. So pretty much, the enemy team is gonna have to help him. Now, if the enemy team is helping whoever is on side lane against me, this game it would be Aatrox, then they're not staying somewhere else, they're not farming other lanes, and they're not farming the resources around the map. This means that our team is gonna keep accelerating, and while we might not, that doesn't matter, because as I said, we want to stay at 2 items compared to the enemy team's 1 item for as long as possible. So even if we are losing resources, if we're denying them resources, then that's good for us. Now all of this with denying resources from the enemy team while trying to keep us and them at the same item as long as possible is pretty advanced, and it might also seem that way. The truth is that a lot of Grandmaster and Master players don't even apply this, but I feel like it's worth to mention because that's ideally how you want to play Nidalee in the mid game. Because you do spike a lot faster than enemy champions, or you curve a lot faster as you say, but they spike really hard later on into the game. So this is something that's pretty important to understand on Nidalee, and while playing Nidalee is that you actually don't spike that hard later into the game, so you have to push your advantage and you have to starve the enemy champions as much as possible. Alright, so the last thing I want to go through with you guys is how you're supposed to play team fights with my style of Nidalee Toplane. In order to do that, we must first understand when we're supposed to team fight with Nidalee Toplane. Now there are pretty much 2 scenarios where you can team fight with Nidalee Toplane. The first of which is if you're contesting a really important objective. For example, if either your or the enemy team is doing Baron Nashor, then that's fine to contest with your team of course. Or if Drake is spawning, then that's of course a really important objective as well, most of the time. If the enemy team is trying to siege down important towers or important objectives in your base as well, then that's of course also fine to contest if you feel like you can. Now the other scenario where you actually can team fight is if you have some sort of advantage somewhere else on the map. So for example, if you pressure an enemy side lane but you do not feel like you can take the enemy tower, then you can push it in and then rotate into the mid lane. This will make it so that the enemy top laner or whoever is facing you in the split push has to catch the wave while you can look for a fight in the mid lane. A lot of the time this will make it so that you're either in a 4v3 with a numbers advantage or in a 5v4. Alright, how do we actually want to team fight with Nidalee Toplane? Pretty much what we want to do is we want to be able to poke as much with our auto attacks as possible. Our auto attacks actually deal a lot of damage with this build, especially when you get a Sheen proc in with it, so always try to get a W in melee form in after the ranged auto attack in order to proc the Sheen as well. You don't really have to be scared of taking a little bit of poke because you have a lot of healing with your Divine Sunder already and you're pretty tanky. So pretty much you want to keep on harassing as much as possible with ranged auto attacks all the time, and then when you hit a spear or a trap on someone who you feel like is low enough, then you can go in for the kill in melee form. You usually don't have to be scared about dying afterwards because, as I said before, you are pretty tanky, so if you do get a kill, you will usually get out as well. If any of you guys have played Heroes of the Storm in the past, then this build will feel a lot like playing Grey main from that. The style of the build and how you want to play the champion is a lot of hit and run and then going in for the kill when people are low. You want to abuse the fact that you're really tanky and deal a lot of damage with auto attacks, and also that you're really slippery in teamfights. If you abuse all of these tools correctly, then I honestly believe that Nidalee Toplane isn't even that bad and can be meta if played in the right circumstances. Alright, anyways guys, that's gonna be it for this guide. I really hope I explained as much as possible, as clearly as possible. And if you liked the video or disliked the video, then please leave feedback down below, even if it's positive or negative, just so that I can improve my videos until next time. I'd also appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel after watching this video, because you've just watched 30 minutes of content that is supposed to help you play the game better or enjoy a champion that you might enjoy specifically a lot better. You know, right now I'm doing this for free, so if you can help me out by pressing a button that really takes you no effort at all, then please do so. Otherwise, if you have any friends or someone who might enjoy this guide as well, then please share it with them, as I'm sure they will appreciate it as well. And otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed, guys. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more.